Good morning, everyone. I love how it all went quiet in anticipation. Okay, cool. I realized, though I don't know how many people were in the room for the last talk, but I didn't actually introduce myself. Not that I'm important, but there's some connections to the next talk and to this person. So my name's Emma Mulholland. My background's product management, which gives me the connection into Ross. I did used to work with Ross in a previous life, but Ross is a full-stack software engineer who loves product, which makes me happy as well. So Ross is, I'm going to give you notes, coffee-loving, rugby-playing. These are all critical criteria for him. Product-focused software engineer. And the dog, in case you're wondering, because I wanted to know, I'm a dog person, the dog's called Frank. So he's about to talk about the Redux. And there will probably be time for Q&A as well, so keep that in mind. If you have any questions, we'll give the roving mics out at the end, and we'll get those answered for you. Okay? Take it away, Ross. Oh, this is his first talk, and he's going to be wonderful, but okay.
All right. Cheers, all. So, can everyone hear me? Yep, all good. Yeah, so this is my first talk, so please be nice. But yeah, I guess we'll just get started. So, hi, my name is Ross Jenkins. I'm a software engineer at GearSet. I've always been full stack, but in the sort of last few years, I've found a bit more of an affinity for front end development. So, as Emma sort of alluded to, I absolutely love being right in the middle of dev, product, and UX, and working with React, I've found puts me in that position really often. But anyway, yeah, so I've been working with React and with Redux for several years now, and since joining GearSet, I've had the opportunity to attend a couple of fantastic React conferences. So I've got out to React Summit out in Amsterdam, and I got to React Conf itself over in Henderson, Nevada, and in Las Vegas, and really attending conferences like these and hearing from some of the sort of most influential people in the React ecosystem and the community. This really gave me an itch to have a wee go at my own wee talk in the React space. So I started with the Redux, a bit of a play on words, and just thought, let's see what comes out the other side of it. So yeah, what am I yapping about this morning? Today I want to revisit Redux. It was at one point the go-to state management library for React projects, but as React in this ecosystem has grown and changed, it's started to lose a wee bit of its shine and its popularity. Developers see it as being complicated, it's cumbersome, and really it's just a bit outdated. But here's the thing, over the years Redux has grown and changed too. With Redux Toolkit, it's a very different library from what it used to be. It keeps the things that made Redux so revolutionary at the time. It's predictable, it's consistent, it comes with powerful debugging tools, and it also fixes a lot of the things that developers found frustrating. So yeah, this is the Redux, how Redux is adapted to fit into modern development patterns, and why it's still considering in 2024. We'll also take a quick look at sort of why we chose to adopt it at GearSet. But this talk, I'm not trying to give you the hard sell on Redux. I'm not trying to tell you it's something that isn't. We're not really going to delve too deeply into the inner workings of Redux either. I'm going to have to leave that as an exercise for the audience if you're not already a little bit familiar with how Redux works. So to set the scene, soon after teams started moving away from the popular sort of MVVC or MVVM frameworks of the time, like Ember.js and Backbone.js over to React, they realized they needed a way to share state across components. They wanted that shared state to be consistent across them, and they also wanted it to still obviously be reactive to changes. So React didn't really solve that problem. It didn't really prescribe a way to solve it. Now this is because React is really more concerned with solving problems at the view level, like actually getting the rendering or representation of that state on the client. So oftentimes you had to resort to writing quite messy code to share that state across the component tree. So to kind of visualize it here, I've got a small diagram of roughly how a small component tree would look. You can see sort of down at the bottom, we've got a couple of child components, and I've just kind of labeled that these are two guys that need the shared piece of state. So often you'd you kind of create that state up on the top level, like a root component, and you'd have to pass it down several layers of children to get the data down to where you need it. That scenario is known as prop drilling, and really quickly it becomes quite unmanageable. So to put Redux into the picture, what made it so revolutionary? It's centralized state management, placing state into a single store, separating it from the components, and sort of solving that prop drilling problem for deeply nested components. The components themselves just subscribe to the store, which you can see sort of down on the bottom side there. There's like kind of boundary, like the top level is where React lives, the bottom level is where Redux is, and so the components just grab what they need to grab out of it. Redux was predictable, it was consistent, as the state itself was just an immutable object. The way that you would update it is by, you would update it through like pure functions, you would update it through actions and reducers. Additionally, it was much easier to test and debug with Redux, because, like as I mentioned, reducers themselves are pure functions, and the Redux dev tools offered a way for users to time travel. They could step back and forward through actions, and they could visualize state changes. So really, Redux wasn't just a library, it actually offered an architectural solution to client-side state. It encourages you to think about state as an immutable object, and the store is responsible for just like handling it, wrapping it. Updates to the store are done by dispatching actions, which are handled by reducer functions. And this pattern reduces the likelihood of side effects. Like you can kind of see here, I've got like an example. So we've got a component at the top. The component dispatches a complete to-do action, which goes down into the store through the reducers, and the state falls out the bottom of it, and then is fed back into the component. Whilst this certainly adds complexity, it offers a reliable, scalable way to manage state. So for years, Redux was really the go-to solution for React apps. It almost became the next library you would install after adding React to your project. But over time, Redux started to face a fair amount of criticism, and the React ecosystem itself had gone through some pretty major changes. So what happened? Firstly was those architectural changes I've mentioned just now. So React itself has made managing state easier. It now has built-in tools like hooks and the context API. Those are pretty good for managing like local and small amounts of state. And again, for smaller applications, this can often be good enough, and you could use it to eliminate the need for a state management library like Redux. Sorry. So yeah, next there's been a proliferation of alternatives. Some of these are squarely addressing Redux's concerns, pain points, but typically they're kind of more, like they would be tailored to a specific sort of use case. We're going to have a wee look at some of these later, and that's what some of these logos kind of correspond to. Next, there's change in development patterns. So React has been shifting towards a server for the last couple of years. The growing popularity of server-side rendering, frameworks like Next.js, and building apps that are kind of a bit more API first, so to speak. Many apps are more reliant on server-side state rather than client-side state, and that sort of reduces the need for a client-side state management solution altogether. And then lastly, Redux itself became a problem. It introduces a lot of boilerplate, like that diagram I showed you before. Writing actions, reducers, managing the store, managing the state, and then writing logic to actually update things. With the state being an immutable object, it's just all very cumbersome, repetitive, and there's a lot of bugs were kind of latent in Redux code at the time. So for many developers, Redux's complexity started to outweigh its benefits. And so in recent years, people have just chosen alternatives for managing this sort of stuff. So the first alternative is not to adopt anything at all. React now has built-in concepts to help manage local state, or sorry, to manage state. There's the local state hooks like useState and useReducer, and then there's the context API. For small to medium-sized projects, this might just be good enough. But the issue is that it might not scale very well. As your application becomes a bit more complex and grows in size, there's inherently going to be more state to manage, and the kind of scenarios around state management become more complex. Additionally, you might just want to kind of separate those two concerns of your stateful logic and your presentational logic. And so if you're going to want to do that, you might need to adopt something later on the line. So let's have a wee look at some of the things you could adopt that aren't Redux. So the first sort of bucket is just an alternative state management library, like an alternative client-side state management library. In the years since Redux was introduced, there's been a proliferation of these, and many of them sort of try to fill a specific gap in the market. And the first and most popular one would be Zustand. It markets itself as a lightweight, unopinionated Redux alternative. It takes a more minimalist approach to state management. It's flexible, it's easy to set up, but still provides like a decent basis of functionality if you're looking for a Redux alternative. Next would be Jotai. That takes a more atomic approach to state management. So instead of like a single store, everything's stored as like multiple small atoms, and that kind of composes your global state. These act more similarly to sort of reactive primitives, like if you're familiar with like signals, for instance. This makes it composable and really easy to incrementally adopt. And the last one to talk about in this bucket is MobX, which is a signals-based reactive programming approach to managing state. This is great if like reactivity and fine-grained updates are what you're looking for, but it doesn't really align with React's concepts of data flow, like sort of unidirectional data flow. This can make it a bit more difficult to debug and really would have quite a steep learning curve compared to most. And the last sort of bucket here would be like data fetching libraries, which sometimes would call themselves asynchronous state management. So today, like a lot of applications forgo like a traditional client-side state management solution altogether because they've become more server-driven, like I mentioned before. In this context, it's more important to use a library that solves problems around data fetching, caching, and validation, that sort of stuff. And the first and most popular one here would be TanStack Query, formerly known as React Query. It's one of the most like commonly adopted libraries in the React ecosystem. It focuses, like I said, on asynchronous state, fetching, caching, synchronizing data with the server. But it doesn't have any concepts in mind to fix like additional client-side state or strictly client-side state. So often you might have to pair TanStack Query with something like Zustand or indeed Redux if you have more complex client-side state to manage. The next one is SWR. Sorry. This is a library created by Vercel, and it was inspired by the steal while we validate HTTP caching strategy. It's a really small, simple application, and it's great for just if you want to wrap simple API interactions. And lastly, in this bucket that I want to talk about today is Apollo Client. It's really the go-to state management library for GraphQL APIs. It's a powerful framework built around making like your mutations and your queries easier. And it actually has built in now some more sort of client-side state management concepts. So really, like the actual conversation around state management is just more nuanced now than it was back when Redux was introduced in 2015. The libraries I mentioned before aren't necessarily meant to be drop-in replacement for Redux or necessarily solve the same problems as Redux does. And also, you don't really need to make the decision right away about state management in React anymore. I'd really encourage people to just lean on React's concepts of local state and the context API up until the point where a solution is necessary. Then really just choose the best one for your product, or choose the best one for your project, and then incrementally adopt it. But if and when you do reach that point, yeah, I'd like to ask you to consider opting for Redux Toolkit. So where does Redux fit in today? Enter Redux Toolkit. This is a modernized version of Redux. It's been designed to address the pain points that I had alluded to earlier that led to so many developers choosing to move away from Redux altogether. And it describes itself as the batteries included approach to Redux. So here's how it's managed to bring Redux into the modern day. The first point is it simplifies setup. Redux Toolkit extracts away a lot of the boilerplate associated with like setting up your Redux store. It provides a configure store function that automatically sets up those Redux dev tools, integrates commonly used middleware like Thunks for asynchronous stuff, and just encourages a clean architecture by only having a single place to configure your store and everything related to it. So you can kind of see here from behind me like how a fairly long-winded, kind of disconnected process just becomes a lot more streamlined and is handled in one neat function call. Like both of these code snippets produce an equivalent Redux store. The next point is it reduces boilerplate and builds in some best practices around Redux. So on top of simplifying that process of setting the store up, RTK uses slices to simplify state organization and further reduce some of that boilerplate. The slices used to simplify and co-locate the reducer logic, the actions, action creators, and setting your initial state. You're encouraged to use this slice-based design to organize your state logically by feature, rather than as like one big massive reducer or a set of disparate reducers. And again, like here, these two blocks of code are equivalent to one another. With Redux, or traditional Redux, you have to go set up all your action types, set up your action creators, set up your initial state, and then you've got a big long-winded switch statement down below for the reducer itself. But with RTK, that's all done in one place. It's just one function called create slice, and in there you can define your initial state, all your actions, and your reducers all in one place. Next, Redux Toolkit adds some powerful utilities. On top of configure store and create slice, RTK builds in create async thunk. That handles creating asynchronous actions, which can be used for handling stuff like API calls or just stuff that has side effects. It automatically also creates actions for like handling the different kind of promise states like pending, success, and error, and then the slices can just subscribe to that directly without having all the extra boilerplate of figuring that stuff out. So you can kind of see in the top left there, I've got this fetch to-dos, which is like a mock sort of like call to an API to go and get some to-dos and stick those into state. And then down below, you can see how the slice can just pretty easily hook into those events and set things like a loading state, an error state, succeed state. The next point then is create selector. This is just re-exported from reselect. It's a library that gets commonly paired with Redux and other sort of libraries that deal with like managing immutable state. This handles deriving complex sort of derived state and keeps its value in sync as things like the underlying state changes. So you can see like in the bottom right, I've got like a wee example of a create sector usage where I'm just like picking out the completed to-dos from my list of to-dos. And so like anytime the actual list of to-dos themselves changes, or if I uncomplete something or complete something else, that state will all get kept in sync. And then lastly is RTK query. This is a data fetching and caching solution that's actually built into RTK. It simplifies working with APIs by handling all that caching, invalidation, update logic all for you. This is really built to compete with libraries like TanStack Query. So the example there in the top right, this to-dos API, that's roughly equivalent to the code on the left. So you can see how it kind of like further like reduces boilerplate. And it handles things like error states and loading states and all that for you. So ultimately, Redux Toolkit retains the strengths that made Redux great. It's predictable, consistent state management, an immutable state approach, and fantastic dev tools. It's just been modernized to meet the needs of today's developers with less overhead, better ergonomics, and features like RTK query that extend Redux. So it doesn't make Redux just easier to use. It makes it kind of relevant again and repositions it as a powerful tool for 2024. And at GearSet, we found Redux Toolkit invaluable for managing complex state in our app. So I'll have a quick look at how we put it to work and why we chose to adopt it. So at GearSet, we've been steadily migrating our app from Knockout.js over to React. We started this a couple of years ago. We had some pretty complex view models, lots of states, and at the beginning of the migration, we found that we were just creating these large so-called God components that just held on to basically all the old state from the view model, and it was just really difficult to work with. Like really, we just end up running into all like a kind of familiar class of problems that developers were running into way back in 2015 when Redux was introduced. we had these like large, unwieldy components that were responsible for handling way too much state. We had that prop drilling scenario where we were passing state down multiple layers of child components. And then we just had loads of side effects and race conditions. And these were difficult to test and difficult to cover with tests and debug. So here's like another obligatory AI generated image of me, but this is as close as I could get. I think he's much better looking. Trying to migrate something from Knockout to React, and fun fact, it took me 4 goes to get ChatGPT to remove his glasses. So I think the AI is just really confident that we all need glasses. So at this point, we decided we needed a solution to address the issues I sort of went over before. And there's a few reasons why we decided to go with RTK. Again, that kind of predictability, testability, debuggability. Our application is pretty large. It's a lot of complex state to manage. So the pros of having Redux as a solution all really align squarely with what we were requiring. And then combine that with the Redux dev tools, you could track those state changes and visualize things as we went. We can inspect actions and debug issues quicker than we could before. Next, we could break down those larger components by introducing slices. Shifting state into the Redux store, we were able to reduce the size and the complexity of the components in our application. We could push all that state-related complexity out of the component layer and into a separate state layer. And then we could just shift all the business logic out of the component into things like selectors and actions and thunks. The next important thing for us is that RTK came with built-in best practices. It's an opinionated approach, and all those utilities that comes built in with really set you up for success. I think without the specific stuff that RTK extended Redux with, I think like the idea of adopting Redux today is much less appealing. And lastly is familiarity. Like both Redux and Redux Toolkit are like really well adopted libraries. Many React developers have either worked with it before or are familiar with its concepts. And additionally, there's loads of resources out there to help you debug issues and get set up, including the RTK's docs themselves are like fantastic, probably some of the best docs I've ever read. So since adopting RTK, we've been able to significantly improve how we manage complex state, both when we're migrating existing features and whenever we're writing new ones. It's helped us move more quickly, confidently, as we know that we've got this battle-tested approach to managing complex state. So, because everybody loves best practices, I thought I'd include a wee best practices slide of things that we've learned along the way. So the first one here is those feature-based slices. We organize state into well-defined feature-specific slices. Each slice is self-contained, keeping our code modular, extendable, easy to test. It takes some of the decision-making, really, out of adding new features, because you know you can just add a new slice early on and see what happens. Next, we extensively use thunks for doing async logic. Thunks are our go-to for handling async operations, stuff like fetching data and managing side effects. They've kept our reducers more pure and predictable. And it also goes some way to help simplify more complex stuff like polling for updates and making optimistic updates to state. The next thing we use a lot is selectors and memoization. Selectors help us keep our components cleaner by, again, just separating out all of that kind of complex state derivation logic outside of the UI layer. And then using create selector helps us memoize all that, so to try and improve the performance of our app. Next, we try and model actions events. We've taken RTK's guidance on this, and you try to model your events as actions rather than just like state setters. We define these actions to try and reflect user interactions with our application or app events, and this goes some way to keep things intuitive and aligned with user behavior. Like for example, like going back to my to-dos slice from earlier, instead of having like a set to-dos action that just takes a set of to-dos and dumps them into state, we would have a separate add to-do action which takes the to-do that you want to add, and then another action that would for deleting the to-do, which would just take the ID of the to-do that you want to remove. And then the actual business logic of how that happens under the hood is then handled by Redux. And lastly, we've used RTK to write loads of tests. By focusing on testing pure functions like reducers and selectors, we've made our unit test suite simpler, faster, and a bit more robust. The shift has reduced the need for writing heavy component tests and given us a bit more confidence in our stateful logic. So like my hot take here really for my React devs in the room is that I'd rather test pure functions than test React components. So with these practices, Redux Toolkit has helped us build like a comprehensive solution to state management at GearSet. It's made migrating to React and building new features in React smoother by allowing us to separate concerns. It's helped improve our code's robustness by exposing a massive surface for testing. So to wrap up, why does Redux still matter in 2024? With Redux Toolkit, we've taken everything that was great about Redux, its predictability, scalability, and testability, and just fixed the things that makes it feel like a chore. At GearSet, it's been invaluable for managing complex state. It's helped us break down messy components, build a framework around handling async logic, and write code that's easier to test, debug, and maintain. But Redux isn't the right choice for every app, and it doesn't really need to be either. But when you're dealing with a large-scale project or tricky state management problems, our Redux Toolkit is well worth considering. So yeah, this is the Redux, a tool that's grown and adapted, and one that still has plenty of life in it. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of NIDC.
Thank you, Ross. We do actually have 5 minutes if anybody has any questions. I think you did a fantastic job of trying to convince us all to use Redux there. He's a brilliant salesperson. But are there any questions?
Thanks for a really great talk, Ross. As you know, I'm not much of a front-end developer myself, but the one thing that has always been a little bit of uncertainty for me with RTK is when should I reach for something like Thunks, and when should I reach for something like RTK query? Like, is there an obvious differentiation in your mind of like when I should use one over the other?
It's a great question. So we are not using RTK query at the minute, but me and my colleague Mark have both spiked it, and ergonomically it's nice. It's like a nice syntactic sugar, and like it's like if you just want like a hook that says use get me this data, that's grand. It's nice that it like hooks in that layer and loading state, but I think we've stuck with using Thunks because it's a bit more flexible. You have to write a wee bit more code, but you can be a bit more granular around like error handling because our API like returns errors in a certain way, so you can write your own specialized logic around handling those errors and all that sort of stuff. Because you can just hook it back into a slice and you can put whatever you want in there. So I think that's been partly why we haven't adopted RTK query, but it's something that I would like to adopt at some point. I just haven't got around to like doing the whole tech roadmap and proposing it and all that sort of stuff. Cool.
Any more?
Hi, could you say more about the benefits that you found when it comes to testing, going from component tests to the pure functions that you were talking about that you got with Redux?
Yeah, another great question. So we haven't completely foregone component tests. I think there's some teams doing GearSet still extensively write them. I tend not to write them so much. Again, I think the approach really boils down to like whenever we've got like a kind of a large unit of functionality and it's all like heavily like connected to Redux. Whenever you're writing component tests, it feels like you're not really testing the component, like you are testing its integration to Redux. So I think we've found that basically breaking down the component, saying here's all the actions it dispatches, here's all the data it subscribes to. So why not just test that directly by writing unit tests for, again, like a reducer, which is a pure function. Like, you know, it's like with the right initial state and the right chains, it's always going to output the same. It's always going to output the same thing. And the same goes for selectors. It's pure logic, so you can just put in whatever initial state you want, and then just test that it's doing what you expect it to do. Yeah. Whereas, like again, if you're testing a component, you're not really like you're testing React. There's all sorts of side effects and stuff that can happen. Cool.
Excellent. I think that might be us then. Thank you very much to Ross, who did fabulously in his first big talk. There you go. Slides will be up. You can now see the talks that are in all the different rooms. Again, there's a 15-minute buffer between talks, so you can grab a coffee, wander about, and then come back here or move on to another room if you wish. Thank you.
Thank you all again.